There is a strange kind of quiet that happens when you finally stop explaining yourself, when you stop chasing clarity, when you stop trying to prove that you are safe to love, and that quiet is not empty. It is heavy, it is full, it is the kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled because it finally belongs to you. And what no one prepares you for is how violently that silence echoes inside the person who is used to your emotional noise. The title says the avoidant is crashing out because of your silence. And that is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is a psychological event because for the first time, the dynamic that kept them regulated has disappeared. And you didn't announce it. You didn't threaten it. You didn't weaponize it. You simply withdrew your emotional availability without anger, without punishment, without performance. And that is what makes it unbearable for them. Your silence is not loud on the outside, but inside them, it is deafening because it removes the role you played in keeping their nervous system comfortable. They were never calm. They were managed by your presence, by your reassurance, by your willingness to lean in when they pulled away. And now that loop is gone and they don't know how to exist without it. So while you may think nothing is happening because there are no messages, no confrontations, no dramatic reactions, the truth is something has already started unraveling quietly inside them, and it begins with the realization that you didn't disappear to provoke them. You disappeared to return to yourself, and that distinction changes everything. At first, your silence feels to them like a glitch, something temporary, something that will correct itself. Because in their history, people eventually break. They eventually reach out. They eventually soften. They eventually need something. And the avoidant has learned to wait that out. They learned distance gives them power. And that time restores access. But this time, something feels wrong. Not alarming yet, just unfamiliar because the silence doesn't carry anxiety. It doesn't carry threat. It doesn't carry longing. It carries neutrality, and neutrality is terrifying to someone who relies on emotional leverage to feel secure. They expected you to break the pattern. They expected the late night message, the accidental call, the emotional explanation that reopens the door. And when that doesn't happen, their mind starts scanning for reasons. Did you get distracted? Did you meet someone? Did you finally give up? And each possibility destabilizes them because none of those options put them back in control. This is where the crash actually starts, not with pain, but with confusion, because confusion removes certainty, and certainty is what allowed them to keep intimacy at a distance. Your silence doesn't feel like abandonment yet. It feels like unpredictability, and unpredictability activates their nervous system in a way closeness never did. As the days stretch, the silence begins to press on something deeper than ego. It starts touching the part of them that believed you would always be emotionally available. No matter how inconsistent they were, this is where their internal panic shows up, not outwardly, not dramatically, but somatically. They feel restless, they check their phone more often, they replay interactions, they analyze tone, they reread the last exchange, searching for a clue that tells them whether you're still accessible. And the reason this hurts more than an argument is because there is nothing to push against, no energy to resist, no signal to interpret your silence, doesn't give them a role to play, and avoidants rely on roles, distance maker, independence protector, nonchalant, one they don't know who they are, when someone stops orbiting them emotionally. So while you are stabilizing, while you are regulating, while you are reconnecting to your own center, they are becoming dysregulated because the system they used to lean on is no longer responding, and the irony is they often mistook your pursuit for pressure, when in reality it was what allowed them to feel wanted without having to show up. Now, without that pursuit, they are left alone with the question they've avoided their entire life. What happens if I am not chosen when I am not chased? This is the point where they begin to experience your silence as rejection. even if you never rejected them, because avoidants often confuse calm with disinterest and boundaries with abandonment. Your emotional quiet forces them to confront something they never had to face before. The possibility that your presence was not guaranteed, that you were choosing them, not clinging to them. And once that illusion breaks, their internal narrative starts to shift. They may tell themselves you are being cold or immature or manipulative because those stories protect them from the deeper truth that you find stopped negotiating your worth. But beneath that story, something else is happening. They are looping, mentally replaying moments you've already integrated. They are wondering why you haven't reached out, why you aren't fixing it, why you aren't reacting, because reaction was the proof that they mattered. And without it, they feel unseen in a way. They don't know how to articulate. This is not the kind of pain that makes someone cry to friends. It is the kind that sits quietly in the chest as irritation, as distraction, as restlessness. And this is why avoidants often look fine on the outside during the phases. They are not fine, they are fragmented because the emotional mirror they relied on has gone dark. Eventually, the silence forces a reckoning, not a dramatic one, not a sudden realization, but a slow, uncomfortable awareness that something has shifted in you, and that shift did not require their participation. They begin to sense that you are no longer waiting for them to come closer or further away, because you are no longer orienting your emotional world around their behavior, and that is where the loss of power truly lands. They didn't lose you in a fight, they lost you in stillness, and stillness cannot be argued with, negotiated with, or reversed through charm. This is where regret begins. Necessarily regret for hurting you, but regret for assuming you would always be there, because now even the idea of reaching out feels risky. If they message and you respond neutrally, it confirms the loss. If they message and you don't respond at all, it deepens it, so they hover in indecision from a distance, monitoring signs of your independence, reading into your absence. And what makes this phase so intense is that your silence has turned you into safety in their mind, not pressure, not expectation, not demand, safety. Because you are no longer asking them to abandon themselves to love you. And that is the cruel paradox. They feel closest to you when you are no longer reaching for them. By the time they fully register that your silence is not a tactic, but a transformation, the crash has already happened internally. They may not name it, but they feel it as an ego wound, as a loss of dominance, as a sudden awareness that they are not the center of your emotional universe anymore. That is what destabilizes avoidance more than heartbreak. You did not leave in pieces. You did not beg. You did not threaten. You simply stepped back into yourself, and that teaches them something they never learned through conflict. That access to you is not automatic, and love that is not chased, be controlled. And whether they eventually reach out or stay silent themselves, the truth remains the same. Your silence did not end the connection. It exposed the dynamic, and once exposed, it can never go back to what it was, because you can never unknow what it feels like to choose yourself, and can never unknow what it feels like to lose control without being attacked. And that is why your silence is not empty. It is powerful, because it marks the moment the relationship stopped being about convincing someone to stay and started being about honoring yourself enough to stop waiting for someone who only felt safe when you were smaller, quieter, and endlessly available. And once that truth settles into their body, the watching begins. Not the obvious kind, not messages, not likes, not sudden confessions, but quiet surveillance. Because when control is lost, observation becomes the substitute. They start noticing your absence in places they didn't expect it. Your energy is no longer circling them. Your emotional tone is no longer reactive. Your life no longer pauses at the edge of their availability, and that unsettles them deeply, because avoidants are experts at distance, but not at irrelevance. They can handle someone being upset. They can handle being missed, even handle being resented. What they cannot handle is becoming optional. So they watch from the edges, trying to detect whether your silence is fragile or rooted, whether it is a phase they can wait out or a boundary they cannot cross. And every sign of your steadiness, Every moment you don't collapse, every indication that your life is continuing without emotional leakage confirms something they don't want to accept, that you are no longer emotionally reachable in the same way. And this is where the crash intensifies. Because now silence is no longer confusing. It is threatening, not because it hurts, but because it removes their leverage. They don't know how to re enter a dynamic where they are not needed to feel important. At first, there is a strange sense of relief mixed into the panic they tell themselves. This is good, that space is what they wanted, that independence feels better than expectation. But relief doesn't last long because relief requires distraction, and your silence removes the distraction of managing you. There are no emotional fires to put out, no reassurance to ration, no closeness to regulate. So the emptiness gets louder. They begin to notice the quiet moments at night, the idle moments during the day, the spaces where your presence used to live. And this is where regret starts to seep in, not dramatic regret, not apologies, not accountability, but a low hum of discomfort. Because distance didn't heal them, it just removed the mirror that reflected their patterns. And without that mirror, they are left with themselves. And that is something they have always avoided. This is why they often start romanticizing you during this phase, not because they suddenly understand you, but because your absence allows them to rewrite you into something safer than reality. Someone who didn't ask too much, someone who felt like someone who didn't require vulnerability, and that fantasy becomes a refuge because it doesn't demand change. But even that fantasy is unstable because it is built on loss. Your silence also wounds something subtler than fear. It wounds their ego because it disrupts the hierarchy they unconsciously relied on. They were used to being the one who pulled back, the one who dictated pace, the one who decided when closeness happened. And now that script has flipped without a word spoken. You didn't confront them. You didn't challenge them. You didn't even disengage dramatically. You simply stopped orienting around them. And that communicates something far more powerful than anger. It communicates that they are not the axis of your emotional world anymore. And that realization hits avoidance in a delayed way. It creeps in as irritation, as judgment, as dismissiveness. They may tell themselves, you were never that important. Anyway, they may downplay the connection. They may criticize your silence to protect themselves. But none of that works because the body knows what the mind denies. They feel replaced. Even if you are alone, because your peace feels like competition, and the idea that you can be okay without them destabilizes the identity they held as someone who was needed without having to fully show up. Eventually, the internal pressure creates an urge to reappear, but not fully, not vulnerably, not honestly, because that would require risk. Instead, they want to test the door. They want to see if access still exists without exposing themselves. So they consider a casual message a neutral check-in, something that allows them to gauge your emotional availability without committing to anything. And this is where your silence becomes a turning point because how you respond or whether you respond at all teaches them something fundamental. If you over-explain, if you rush to reconnect, if you emotionally soften too quickly, the old dynamic snaps back into place and their nervous system relaxes because control has been restored. But if you remain grounded, if your energy stays contained, if you respond without leaning, without chasing, without offering reassurance, they feel the loss fully. That is painful, not because you are punishing them, but because you are no longer managing their discomfort. And that is the first time many avoidants encounter a relationship where someone does not sacrifice themselves to keep the connection alive. What your silence has been teaching them all along is not a lesson you set out to teach, but one they cannot avoid learning. Access to you is not guaranteed. Emotional availability is not endless. Presence is not something they can step away from and return to without consequence. And consequence here does not mean punishment. It means reality. It means that relationships move. They evolve, they respond to energy. And when one person grows, the dynamic cannot stay the same. This realization forces a choice they have avoided for years. Either they step toward vulnerability or they retreat into safety. Neither option feels good because stepping forward requires self-confrontation and retreating means accepting loss. And this is why the crash feels so intense. It is not about missing you, it is about being forced to see themselves without the buffer of your emotional labor. As they sit in this tension, something shifts quietly. They begin to recognize that your silence is not cold. It is self contained, and that distinction matters because coldness invites defense. But self containment commands respect. They start to understand on a nervous system level that you did not disappear to manipulate them. You disappeared because you no longer needed to be where you were, not met, and that understanding is destabilizing because it reframes the entire story they told themselves about you, about the relationship, about their role in it. They can no longer see you as someone who wanted too much. They have to confront the possibility that you simply wanted alignment, and that is something they could not offer at the time. This is where respect enters the picture. Not admiration, not longing, but a sober recognition that you chose yourself without attacking them. And that choice changes the hierarchy permanently because people who can walk away without burning bridges cannot be controlled through distance. By the time they reach this awareness, the silence has done its work regardless of what happens next. Whether they reach out or not, whether the connection resumes or ends, the dynamic has already transformed because you are no longer the same person who waited, who overgave, and they are no longer able to unsee that shift. They may still struggle, they may still oscillate between wanting closeness and needing distance, but they now understand something that will follow them into every future connection, that emotional availability is a privilege, not a right, and that the most destabilizing thing someone can do is not leave loudly, but leave quietly with their dignity intact. And this is why your silence matters, not because it makes someone crash, but because it marks the moment you stopped abandoning yourself, where self keeps someone comfortable and started trusting that the right connection will not require you to disappear to survive. And after that realization settles, there is a quiet internal split that happens inside them. One part wants to reach for you, not casually, not strategically, but honestly, because they finally understand what they lost, while the other part panics at the idea of exposure. Because reaching out now would mean acknowledging that your silence changed them, and avoidance struggle most with moments that require humility rather than distance. So they freeze suspended between desire and fear, and that freeze is not indifference, it is overload. They feel the urge to explain themselves, to justify their behavior, to rewrite the past in a way that doesn't make them the one who failed. But every version of that story collapses because your silence refuses to engage with revision. There is nothing to argue against, no accusation to defend, no emotional chaos to hide inside. And so they are left with the raw truth that they did not lose you because you were too much. They lost you because they could not meet you where you stood. And that truth lands slowly, painfully, and without drama, which is exactly why it cuts so deep. This is the stage where they start bargaining internally, not with you, but with the idea of you. They imagine scenarios where things could have gone differently, where they might have shown up more, where they might have communicated better, where they might have leaned in instead of pulling away. Imagination is safer than action because imagination does not risk rejection. And this internal bargaining creates an emotional whiplash. One moment they feel close to you, the next they feel shut out. One moment they feel regret, the next they feel resentment, because regret threatens their self-image and resentment restores it temporarily. They may tell themselves you are stubborn or unforgiving because that narrative allows them to avoid the more painful realization that you simply stopped negotiating your needs. And what hurts most about that realization is not the loss of the relationship, the exposure of a pattern they've carried for years. A pattern of keeping people close enough to feel wanted, but far enough to avoid being known. Your silence interrupts that pattern and forces awareness. And awareness is they have been running from. As time passes, the intensity of the crash does not disappear. It changes shape. It becomes quieter, more reflective, more internal. They may not think about you constantly anymore, but you surface in moments of vulnerability. When something goes wrong, when they feel overwhelmed, when they crave connection, but don't know how to ask for it. And in those moments, they remember that your presence once made things feel easier, not because you fixed them, but because you were steady, and that steadiness now feels rare because they realize how much emotional labor you carried without asking for credit, and this recognition brings a different kind of pain. Not longing, but remorse. Remorse for taking your availability for granted, for assuming your patience was infinite, for believing you would always be there to absorb their distance. And the cruel part is that remorse often arrives after the opportunity for repair has passed, not because you closed the door, but because you stepped away from it and learned how to breathe without waiting for someone to follow. This is also the stage where they begin to project meaning onto your silence. They interpret it as strength, as finality, as self-respect, and while they may not admit it, they start comparing future connections to the standard you unknowingly set. They notice when others chase too hard or demand too much or lack depth, and they feel unsettled because your absence taught them what regulated presence feels like. And when someone experiences that, even indirectly, they cannot fully forget it. They may try to recreate the dynamic without doing the inner work, seeking partners who are emotionally available but non-threatening, who offer closeness without expectation. But those connections feel hollow because what made your presence powerful was not just availability, it was authenticity. And authenticity cannot be replicated through avoidance. This is where the long-term impact of your silence reveals itself. You didn't just change one relationship, you disrupted a blueprint, and blueprints, once questioned, cannot be restored to their original form. Meanwhile, something equally important is happening on your side. Even if you are not consciously tracking it, you are learning that silence does not equal loss. It equals space. And space allows clarity. You begin to feel your nervous system settle, your thoughts slow, your sense of self return. Realize how much of your energy was spent anticipating someone else's moods, interpreting distance, adjusting yourself to maintain connection. And without that constant adjustment, you reconnect with parts of yourself that were muted. Your intuition sharpens your boundaries, strengthens your self-trust, deepens, and this inner shift is what makes your silence irreversible, because even if contact resumes, you are no longer willing to abandon yourself to preserve peace, and that is the quiet power avoidants feel, but cannot name. They sense that the version of you who would tolerate emotional inconsistency no longer exists. And that realization is both sobering and intimidating because it means the old rules no longer apply. At this point, if they do reach out, it comes from a different place. Not urgency, not control, but uncertainty. They are aware that they cannot approach you the same way because the dynamic has changed, and that awareness makes them cautious. They may still struggle to articulate vulnerability, but they feel the weight of consequence in a way they never did before. And if they choose not to reach out, the silence still serves its purpose because it teaches both of you the same lesson: that connection cannot survive on imbalance, that love cannot be sustained by one nervous system doing all the work, and that the most profound shifts happen not through confrontation, but through alignment. Your silence aligned you with yourself, and that alignment created a ripple they could not ignore. Eventually, the emotional storm inside them settles into something quieter: acceptance. Not resignation, not defeat, but a recognition that what happened was not accidental. It was inevitable, because relationships built on imbalance eventually collapse under their own weight, and silence simply revealed the fault lines. Sooner rather than later, this acceptance may come with sadness, with longing, with reflection, but it also carries a strange respect for you, for your restraint, for your composure, for your ability to walk away without turning the connection into a battlefield. And that respect lingers long after the pain fades, because people remember how you made them confront themselves, even if they never thank you for it. And this is where the story completes itself, not with reunion, not with closure conversations, not with dramatic endings, but with integration. You integrate the lesson that you do not need to chase, to be chosen, that silence can be an act of self-respect, not punishment, that walking away quietly can be more powerful than staying loudly. They integrate the lesson that distance does not protect forever, that avoiding vulnerability does not prevent loss. It delays it, and that emotional availability, once lost, is not easily recovered. And whether your paths cross again or not, the impact remains. Something fundamental shifted inside both of you. Your silence was not an ending, it was a turning point. The moment you chose yourself without hostility, and in doing so, taught them something they will carry into every connection that follows, that love is not about control or pursuit, but about mutual presence. And that when someone stops abandoning themselves to keep you comfortable, you either rise to meet them or you lose them quietly forever. And long after the silence has become your normal and no longer feels like a choice you are actively making, something else becomes clear. The peace you found was never dependent on whether they understood it. And that realization is where your power fully settles, because you stop checking for signs, stop wondering if they miss you, stop imagining what is happening inside them. And this is often when the emotional echo hits them the hardest, not because you disappeared, but because you stopped needing validation from the outcome. Avoidance can sense when someone is still emotionally tethered, even in silence. And when that tether dissolves completely, something inside them recognizes finality, not the finality of never speaking again, but the finality of the old dynamic being unrecoverable. And that awareness can trigger a delayed grief. They did not allow themselves to feel earlier because it requires presence. And now presence is unavoidable. They sit with the understanding that you didn't leave to win. You left to be whole. And that distinction reframes the entire experience, because it means nothing they do now can restore what existed before. And that loss is not dramatic. It is quiet, heavy, and enduring. At this stage, they may revisit the silence not as an event, but as a mirror. They see how often you reached, how often you softened, how often you made yourself smaller to keep the connection stable, and they notice how little they offered in return, without malice, without intention, simply out of habit and fear. And that recognition brings a new layer of discomfort. And guilt, not the kind that seeks forgiveness, but the kind that exposes limitation. They realized they were only capable of receiving love in ways that did not challenge them. And your silence challenged everything. It forced them to confront the cost of avoidance, the relationships that never deepened, the intimacy that never materialized, the pattern of people leaving quietly once they stopped carrying the weight alone. And this is the moment many avoidants either begin real self-work or double down on avoidance, because awareness creates a fork in the road, and not everyone chooses growth. Some choose numbness, some choose distraction, some choose to label you as the problem to protect themselves. But even that choice does not erase the imprint you left, because the nervous system remembers what it felt like to be held without smothered, and once known, that sensation becomes a reference point they cannot fully escape. Meanwhile, your emotional world continues to expand, not because you are trying to prove anything, but because you are no longer contracted around someone else's limits. You begin to trust your instincts again, to feel without editing yourself, to speak without bracing for withdrawal. And this is the deepest shift happens. You stop romanticizing potential and start valuing presence. You no longer feel pulled toward emotional unavailability because your body recognizes the cost, and this embodiment is what makes your silence retroactively meaningful. It wasn't a tactic, it was a transition, seeking connection to embodying it. And people respond to embodiment differently than to effort. They sense it, they respect it, they feel regulated by it. And this is often when new connections appear, not rushed, not intense, but grounded, and the contrast makes everything clear. What you thought was chemistry before was actually anxiety, and what you feel now is steadiness, and that steadiness becomes your baseline. For the avoidant, the crash completes itself when they realize that your silence did not just change how you relate to them, it changed how you relate to yourself. And that change removed their influence entirely. They may still think of you, they may still wonder what would have happened if they had shown up differently. But those thoughts no longer hold power because power requires access, and access was the thing. Your silence quietly revoked, and this is not cruel. It is honest. Relationships are not sustained by patience alone. They are sustained by reciprocity. And when reciprocity is, something has to give. And this time, it wasn't you. This realization lingers with them, not as punishment, but as consequence. And consequence is what creates growth if growth is chosen. As time goes on, the emotional intensity fades into something more neutral, more reflective, and this is where meaning solidifies. They understand that the silence was never about making them hurt, it was about you refusing to hurt yourself any longer. And that clarity strips away the fantasy of control because it reframes the story from abandonment to alignment. And alignment cannot be argued against it. Either exists or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, silence becomes the most respectful response for both people. You respected yourself enough to stop reaching, and in doing so, you respected them enough to stop enabling a dynamic they could not sustain. And that mutual respect, even unspoken, is what gives the ending its quiet dignity. Eventually, the story stops replaying altogether, not because it was unimportant, but because it has been integrated. You no longer need closure conversations because your body already closed the loop. You felt what it was like to choose yourself and survive the fear of letting go. And that experience becomes a reference point. You carry forward into every relationship. It reminds you that love should not require self-erasure, that silence can be sacred when it comes from truth, and that the most powerful boundaries are not announced. They are lived, and this embodied knowing is what makes your presence different now, calmer, steadier, more selective, and people feel that difference immediately. They feel it in how you listen, how you speak, how you don't chase, and how you don't withdraw. You simply stand where you are. And for them, even if they never articulate it, even if they never reach out, even if they convince themselves they are fine, the lesson remains somewhere beneath the surface. They encountered someone who did not fight for attention, but stood in self-respect. And that encounter quietly redefined what connection could be. And whether they rise to meet that standard or avoid it entirely is their journey. But the imprint remains because silence, when rooted in self-worth, does not disappear. It echoes, it reshapes, it teaches without words. And this is why the title holds true, not because your silence caused chaos, but because it removed illusion, the illusion that love can be kept without being tended, the illusion that distance is neutral, the illusion that someone will always stay even when unmet. So the story completes itself here, not with triumph, not with reunion, not with regret, but with truth. Your silence did not destroy the connection. It revealed what was already unsustainable, and in doing so, it returned you to yourself, whole, grounded, and intact. And that is the quiet ending that changes everything, not just for them, but for you. Because once you learn that you do not need to abandon yourself to be loved, you never unlearn it. And once someone encounters that level of self-respect, they are changed by it, whether they grow or not. And that is why silence, when it comes from alignment, not empty, it is transformative. It marks the moment you stopped waiting to be chosen and started choosing yourself. And that choice echoes far beyond one relationship, shaping every connection that follows with clarity, steadiness, and a depth that no longer requires chasing to exist.